Delighted to have been given the honour of introducing Hilary Benn, who's our next speaker. Hilary is the Labour MP for Leeds Central and he's been so since 1999. He's held various ministerial posts, including Secretary of State for International Development, 2003 to 2007. And as a result of that, he was awarded the Grassroots Diplomat Initiative Award for increasing aid during that time. He's been Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. After the change of regime, he held various shadow frontbench posts until becoming Shadow Foreign Secretary 2015 to 2016. Following the Brexit referendum, the government created two new departments, including the Department for Exiting the EU. As is customary, the House of Commons created a select committee to shadow this new department. Hilary was elected chair of the committee in October 2016, beating Kate Hoey 330 votes to 209. The committee first met in November 2016, and in the short 5 months before the general election, it produced 3 reports on the objectives of the government in negotiating the UK's exit from the EU. The committee's reports have been influential, and they persuaded the government to publish its white paper. It also pushed the government to accept the need for a transition period, and with regards to citizens' rights, it told the government that the process for permanent residency, including its 85-page form, was not at all fit for purpose. Following the 2017 election, the committee was reformed, and Hilary was elected, this time unopposed, back to be chair. The committee continues to scrutinise the progress of the negotiations and the government's legislative agenda for Brexit, including the EU withdrawal bill. In addition to reports, the committee holds regular oral evidence sessions with the Secretary of State for leaving the EU. It visits Brussels to meet with Michel Barnier and MEPs, and it's visited Dublin twice to meet politicians. It has also visited the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That was in December 2017. And we'd welcome you back anytime, Hilary. We look forward to hearing your comments today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Katie, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your kind invitation to today's conference. I have to say to you, Anand, organised with the usual impeccable timing of Britain in a changing Europe. The result of the EU referendum, I think it's fair to say, has transfixed UK politics. But it has also affected the Republic of Ireland more than any other EU member state, and potentially will affect Northern Ireland more than any other part of the United Kingdom. And as we learn from life, when a decision is made over which we have no control, but which will result in great consequence for us, it is unquestionably a difficult and uncomfortable experience, especially when so much is at stake, and politicians have been heard to express the view that no deal is better than a bad deal. So, to begin, let me be absolutely clear. No deal is not better than a bad deal. No deal is the worst possible deal you could possibly imagine. And I do not believe that there is a majority in the House of Commons that would accept no deal. But it is also clear that in order to get a deal, the question of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic will have to be sorted by October of this year. Now, as you know, this is not just about trade in goods and services, important though they are. It is about the referendum's impact on that border, on the Good Friday Agreement, and on the lives of the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that is where I wish to begin this afternoon, because the United Kingdom and Ireland share so much in terms of history, culture, ideas, politics and people. And the story of all of these things runs like a thread through these aisles. It is not, of course, entirely a benign or sentimental history, because our relations over the centuries have seen great wrongs, great violence and a revolution. But that thread has remained in place and has found new expression in recent years in ways that would have seemed unimaginable almost 50 years ago, including the reciprocal state visits, the first since independence, made by the Queen in 2011, and President Higgins 3 years later. But the most important development of all was and is the Good Friday Agreement signed 20 years ago. a triumph of patient diplomacy and political courage that has wrought a transformation that I never thought that I would see in my lifetime. And I want to pay tribute to all the people, including some who have spoken at this conference today, for the part that they played in helping to make this happen. It has brought peace and normality in large measure, but not entirely, but it has created something even more intangible, but just as precious. It has provided the opportunity for people to be who they are and not to have to make a choice between the different identities that most of us increasingly have in a more complex and interdependent world. As Peter Sheridan of Cooperation Ireland put it so eloquently, after the Good Friday Agreement, you had this idea of a region whose inhabitants could be British or Irish or both. Europe made that easier to imagine. Now, every one of us knows just how important our shared membership of the European Union was to the crafting of the Good Friday Agreement, and every one of us understands why nothing can be allowed to put that agreement at risk as Brexit unfolds. And that is why the issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic has come to symbolise the choice that the UK government has to make about its approach to Brexit. The Brexit Select Committee has an important job in scrutinising the negotiations and in holding the government to account. And from the beginning of our work, I felt it was really important that if we were going to do it properly, we would have to hear from those outside Westminster and listen to what they had to say to us. And that is why, Katie, Dublin was the first place that the committee went outside the United Kingdom, and we've been back since. And just before Christmas, we visited the border at Middletown between Armagh and Monaghan. Now, never before, I suspect, have so many British parliamentarians have their picture taken by so many photographers while staring at a piece of tarmac. But that's what we did. There's nothing there. It's the whole point. Just a road with yellow and white lines, yellow the Republic, white Northern Ireland, and traffic. Lots of traffic carrying goods and people, travelling back and forth, and pretty fast too. And we stood there and we were told how 35 years earlier, at that very spot, there had been a customs post. You could see it decaying by the side of the road. Checkpoints, an army base, a police station, watchtowers, and murder, all symbols of the Troubles. Now they are gone. And we came away from that visit understanding, I certainly came away from that visit understanding more clearly than ever exactly what is at stake and why we all have a responsibility to ensure that it remains a piece of tarmac with no barriers and no border, so that people and businesses can continue to trade freely along it. Now, understandably, this issue, along with money, citizens' rights, including the very important common travel area, which will of course remain and pre-existed our membership of the common market, dominated phase one of the Brexit negotiations between the United Kingdom and the EU before matters came to a head in December. And we all remember that famous, rather difficult week for some, but a form of words was eventually found that proved enough to secure agreement on that day and so allow progress to phase two of the talks. Now, those words made it absolutely clear that Northern Ireland would not be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, because the UK was committed to full alignment with the European Union in respect of the areas of cross-border cooperation and the all-island, I-S-L-A-N-D, economy, the famous paragraphs 49 and 50. Now, some said it was kicking the can down the road. If that's true, well, the can has now rolled back up again, if that's possible, with gravity, because the EU has now made it clear it wants to see significant progress on this question at the June European Council. Now, why is that? Because for all the time that has passed since December, it is still not clear how the aim of an open border, no checks, no infrastructure, which we all support, will be achieved in practice, either through an agreement or technology, or through this fallback. And in the absence of an answer, many worry that this continuing uncertainty may damage what the Good Friday Agreement has achieved. So this question goes to the heart of the choice facing the government and our Parliament in this crucial defining year about what kind of future relationship we wish to have with the European Union after we have left the institutions, as we will at the end of March 2019, and after the transitional period ends in December 2020. Now, it is, of course, a practical problem. In 2016, UK exports to Ireland were worth nearly £27 billion, and UK imports from Ireland just under £21 billion. These goods move across the Irish Sea and across the border in Northern Ireland. And that is why the Select Committee said we welcomed the government's commitment to no physical infrastructure, no checks at the land border, and also its rejection of a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But in our report, we also said this: we do not currently see how it will be possible to reconcile there being no border with the government's policy of leaving the single market and the customs union, which will inevitably make the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland the EU's customs border with the UK. We call upon the government to set out in more detail how a frictionless border can in practice be maintained with the UK outside the single market and the customs union. Now, thus far, the answer to the question, what does the UK want, has been talk about a deep and special and bespoke partnership. But we have reached the point where that won't do any longer, will it? Progress has been held hostage to internal divisions within the Cabinet. Let's be frank, if anyone had said on the 24th of June 2016, the morning after the night before, that nearly 2 years later, the British government would still have been unable to reach agreement on what kind of customs arrangement and therefore what kind of trade relationship it wants to have with our largest, nearest and most important market, then few would have believed that anything as extraordinary as that could happen. And yet it has. But it is also true to say that as 2018 has progressed, it has become clearer that the government is acknowledging that there are choices and trade-offs that it will need to make in order to achieve the things it says it wants. And now we know that a Brexit white paper will be published ahead of the European Council meeting next month, setting out for the first time in detail the answer to the question, what does Britain want from its future relationship? Which brings me to the customs union and the single market. The government says it is leaving the customs union and the single market, but it also gives the appearance of trying to recreate something similar without having to use those words. It was striking that in her speech at the Mansion House, the Prime Minister spoke almost not at all about divergence from European rules. I have yet to hear an example from ministers of where exactly they would like this divergence to take place. But she did speak a great deal about the need to keep the same rules as the European Union so as to preserve the possibility of access to this huge market. And there now seems to be a recognition that we are going to have something in place on customs until such time as some other agreement is negotiated, which of course brings us back to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, where these two issues are thrown into the starkest relief. Let's begin with the fallback. Paragraph 49 of the December joint report says, in the absence of agreed solutions, the United Kingdom will maintain full alignment with those rules of the internal market and the customs union which now or in the future support North-South cooperation, the all-island economy and the protection of the 1998 agreement. However, it seems to me and others that neither side currently wants to accept what those words mean. For the UK, the fallback would require, in my view, the whole of the country staying in the customs union and the single market, not just Northern Ireland, when it is government policy to leave both. And for the EU, if the UK stayed in the customs union and the single market, This would preempt negotiations on a future partnership, which the EU is clear is a matter for the next phase of the talks. It does not want the most important part of that partnership, trade and rules, to be determined through the medium of the Northern Ireland border, which alone is meant to be an issue for the withdrawal agreement. And when I read that the UK would maintain full alignment, it's clear to me that that must mean the whole of the UK, or else there would be a border down the Irish Sea, which would be unacceptable. The Commission, however, appears to argue that the word UK merely refers to the entity which will ensure the full alignment, rather than the geographical coverage of the alignment itself, if you get my drift. Which is why the EU chose to interpret the fallback by saying that only Northern Ireland would remain in the customs union and be bound by the rules of the single market, even though they knew that this interpretation would be completely unacceptable to the British government. However, one other thing has now become crystal clear. Even if the Cabinet can agree on either the customs partnership or the maximum facilitation option, and even if the EU27 could be persuaded to agree to one or other of these, and there must be a great deal of uncertainty about whether this is possible or likely, neither of the options will be ready in time for the end of the transition period in December 2020. And if that is the case, and if we wish to avoid falling off the cliff, and generally speaking in life it's a very good idea to have that as one of your objectives, then it seems to me pretty clear that we will be remaining in a customs union with the EU, and that we will be following the rules and regulations of the single market for quite some time to come. Now, there are those who argue that the fallback should be time limited, precisely because they don't like the idea of remaining in the customs union and continuing to abide by the rules of the single market for quite some time to come. But I think they miss the point. The fallback is there because both sides have committed to avoiding a hard border, checks or infrastructure. If that cannot be achieved through technology or through the new relationship or a customs partnership, then the fallback will apply unless or until the problem can be solved by other means. Trying, therefore, to set an arbitrary time limit won't work. If a solution can't be found, then the fallback is going to have to continue to apply. And determining when it is no longer needed will be a matter for the EU to determine. It is not in the gift of the UK government. Now, we know that during the last few weeks, everyone has been talking about customs arrangements, and rightly so. I don't think so many cabinet committees and subcommittees have ever been set up to discuss one single subject. But solving the problem of the border in Northern Ireland is not just about customs. It is also about common standards and rules, and that is where the internal market comes in. Now, I hear the argument that is made about the undesirability of being a rule taker. I agree with it because it's an argument that I and many others made during the course of the referendum campaign. But we lost. And having lost, while being a rule taker is not where any of us who campaigned for Remain would wish to be, it is very hard to see how this will not be the inevitable outcome in one form or another. I don't see a British rule maker option if we are to keep an open border with no checks and no infrastructure between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I also don't see a British rule maker option if we wish to maintain access to the single market. And the reality facing British exporters is that they will have to continue to abide by the EU's rules anyway, even where they change, because that will be required to continue to sell into our largest, nearest and most important market. That access, that continuing tariff-free trade with no delays, no rules of origin requirements and no additional customs declarations, a point forcefully made by just about every business that I meet. Tariffs is one thing, but what they really are concerned about is that the just-in-time delivery structures that they have created, because over 45 years it has been as easy to move goods from Milan to London as it has been from London to Edinburgh. It will be essential to the future of the British economy, the Northern Ireland economy, and the economy of the Republic of Ireland. Now, the simplest and best way to achieve that would be to remain in a customs union with the EU, a course of action that David Davis used to support before he became the Brexit secretary. It's what I think we should do. It's the policy of the Labour Party, and it's the approach set out by the Director General of the CBI, Carolyn Fairbairn, in her very, very significant speech at the beginning of this year. And it is something that Parliament, I hope, will get the chance to vote on when the inexplicably shy and retiring trade and customs bills finally reappear on the floor of the House of Commons. Why do I think we should do this? Because 44% of our exports go to our biggest single market, the other member states of the European Union. Because a further 17% go to countries with whom we already have trade agreements because they have been negotiated by the EU on behalf of all of us. And a further 19% goes to the country to which we sell more goods than any other, one, incidentally, with which we do not have a trade agreement at present. It is, of course, the United States of America. Now, do we really think that the President of the United States will be terribly keen to see Britain selling even more into the American market? I somehow think not, given the protectionist approach he is taking to trade. What has been the reaction from India to the suggestion of a free trade agreement? Their first request was to ask the Prime Minister for more work visas for their citizens. And has China suffered disadvantage because it does not currently have a trade agreement with the European Union? No. And in the pocket of, I suspect, every single person in this audience today is proof of that in the mobile phones that we have purchased that were made in China. Trade negotiations are complex for a reason. And that reason is that they involve negotiation between two countries that are each trying to protect their vital interests on the one hand, while seeking to gain advantage in the country with which they are negotiating. So the idea that somehow the United Kingdom has been prevented from trading with the rest of the world by our membership of the European Union is nonsense. Nonsense. What makes sense is for the UK to continue to be part of the customs union, which has given us and the other 27 members of the European Union, including the Republic of Ireland, so much. Secondly, the single market. Michel Barnier, President Macron and others have made it very clear that if the UK wishes to remain in a customs union and the single market, then the EU will facilitate this. But if the Prime Minister continues to insist on all of her red lines, then this will inevitably narrow the range of options open to the negotiators when it comes to our future partnership. And anyone who's been to visit Michel Barnier, I'm sure, has seen the famous stepped slide where he starts with the current relationship, puts the red lines, and gets down to the bottom and says, right, well, I suppose we could do you a Canada deal. When we met him first time, he said, I suppose we could do you a Canada Dry deal, which shows that he has a sense of humour. On the single market, the UK, there are many people in the UK who worry about free movement, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed. And the EU worries about two things. The first, as we all know, is maintaining the unity of the 27 and not offering Britain such a good deal that it might appear attractive to other member states. And secondly, the worry that the UK will use its freedom, going back to the point about divergence, although we hear less of it now, freedom to gain a competitive advantage which will enable us to sell more goods and services into the European market through the door that we will be asking the EU to leave open for us as part of the negotiations. And yet, if you add up all the things that the UK says it's looking for, then EEA EFTA membership is one way of achieving them. And that is why the Brexit Select Committee in its most recent report said, and I quote, should the negotiations on a deep and special partnership not prove successful, EFTA EEA membership remains an alternative and would have the advantage of continuity of access for UK services. The EEA option is available off the shelf and could be negotiated relatively quickly. Now, that is an argument, it seems to me, for leaving that option on the table and not closing it off, not least because combined with remaining in a customs union, it would, it seems to me, provide the answer to the problem of the border. Now, we are 3/4 of the way through the Article 50 process, and yet we haven't even started negotiating our future long-term relationship with the EU. There are now just 6 months to go in which to reach agreement on a withdrawal treaty. How did we get to this point in that condition? Because I think for far too long the government appeared to be contemplating with equanimity going into a negotiation in which, because of the red lines it had adopted, it is facing the almost certain prospect of coming away with a less good deal for trade and services than the one which we currently enjoy, an outcome that will make the UK poorer than it would otherwise have been. And the exit analysis that Parliament instructed should be passed to our committee, and which our committee published, all of it bar 3 pages, showed that that is exactly what the government's own assessment has concluded. Why? Because it has only belatedly begun to face up to the consequences of those red lines for the border. And however skillful the drafting on full alignment as a fallback, and no matter how insistent ministers are that come what may there will be no hard border, no checks and no infrastructure, and I say again, I really welcome that commitment, they have yet to persuade either the Republic of Ireland or the EU negotiators how this will be achieved, given that every other trade agreement in the world, and we spent several weeks looking at all of the agreements that the EU has negotiated with other third countries, all of them involve some border checks and therefore some infrastructure. And some border checks and some infrastructure is not compatible with no checks and no infrastructure, which is what we have to see on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And I think we've also got to this point because ministers continue to insist that it will be possible to negotiate all of these things. Future trading relationship, goods, access for our services, security and foreign policy cooperation, policing, information sharing to fight terrorism, the regulation of medicines, aircraft and food safety, the transfer of data, mutual recognition of qualifications, broadcasting rights, our future role in the 30 or so trade deals which the EU has negotiated to all of our benefit, and everything else. And believe you me, it's a very, very, very long list. Because every person I meet in business and elsewhere says, we know how it works at the moment, will you please explain to us how it's going to work when we leave? Because they have built their businesses on that relationship over 45 years, and they know it's going to be pulled apart and an attempt made to put some of the bits back together again, but they don't know how it is going to work. The government still maintains that this can be dealt with by the end of October. Now, no one else thinks or believes that this is remotely likely. I doubt that ministers actually believe it, but the fact that they still maintain that position, in my view, weakens their credibility, and it undermines confidence at a time when uncertainty is already undermining decisions on the part of companies about their future investment in the UK, and some are making preparatory arrangements because they look at the transitional arrangement, which is extremely welcome and important, but their lawyers say, is it completely certain yet? And the answer is, until it is ratified, the withdrawal agreement by the Council of Ministers, by QMV, qualified majority vote, by the British Parliament and the European Parliament, we're not 100% certain that it will be in place. So what we have is a political agreement on that transition. As I say, I welcome it. We call for it in our first report. It was essential. Without it, the UK, in all likelihood, would fall out of the EU without a partnership agreement. But it means that the government has had to accept, as the Prime Minister set out in her Florence speech, that during the transitional period, almost everything will stay the same, apart from the fact that we will no longer have a voice in the Council of Ministers or the European Parliament. In other words, we will remain in the single market and the customs union, we'll continue to accept free movement, and we will have to go on abiding by judgments of the European Court of Justice. That's what we do know. What we don't know is what will happen once the transition period is over. And we won't know much more at the end of the Article 50 process this autumn, because most of the negotiation will remain to be completed during the transition. So we will probably end up with a withdrawal treaty that includes a political declaration about the future relationship, the future partnership, and both sides are now talking about wanting to include as much detail as possible. But it will still be a declaration. It will not be a treaty, and it will not be a draft treaty. And remember that the European Parliament elections happen next year. There will be the appointment of a new commission, and there could well be a hiatus, which will leave us with relatively little time to finalise negotiations on the future partnership before we have to begin the process of seeking ratification. And the ratification process for the future partnership is more complex and wide-ranging because it will involve the parliaments of the member states than is the case for the withdrawal agreement. And what do we do if the negotiations on a new partnership have not been completed by the time the transition period expires? Well, my answer to that is simple, and I think it's obvious. We would need to extend the transition. But in order to do that, the transition agreement itself must include a clause enabling it to be extended by agreement between the parties. The current draft does not include that clause. It needs to be in there. Finally, and I shall conclude on this point, we come to the role of Parliament. It may seem extraordinary now, especially given that we were told by some on the other side of the argument, other side to me, I'm making no presumption about you, that leaving was all about taking back control, that about a year and a half ago, the government was resisting the idea that Parliament should have the final say on the withdrawal agreement by means of a vote. Now, that's changed, and as you pointed out, Katie, the Select Committee, I hope, played a part in making the government realise that that was a completely impossible position to try and adhere to. The UK Parliament is going to have the final say. It will vote on the draft agreement. But before doing so, I think it will expect to know what our future relationship on trade and services will be and how that open border will be maintained. Because Parliament will be faced with two choices. Leaving with no deal, I don't see any circumstances in Parliament would vote for that. It either approves the withdrawal agreement and moves on to the next process, a part of the process, or it says, well, actually, there is insufficient certainty about where we're heading with all of this, not because it would not have been possible to provide greater certainty. It's just that because of the red lines, the government failed to ask for those things, like, for example, staying in a customs union. And that will be the moment of truth for Parliament and for the country when we come to make that decision. So, I simply say, the time for assurances that all will be well and vague promises has gone. Now is the time for clarity of purpose and policy, and if the government is unable to offer that, then Parliament is going to do it for them. Thank you very much. Well, I'll take questions from anywhere. Yeah.
Okay.
Who's going to be first?
Yes, okay.
Is it all right if I stand up to answer them?
Well, I think you're going to have to. So
good, fine.
Do you want to
Okay.
stand, do you want to stand at the podium?
Well, I'll stand at the podium, yeah. Fine. I'll grab a bit of paper. Who's going to be first?
Who's going to be first?
If we remain in...
Sorry, what's your name?
John Barstow, member of Ulster, the Shop Workers Union, and we're very much in the Remain campaign. If we remain in the customs union, will it still be necessary for those customs bills to come before Parliament, and as things security and defence are very much in the UK DNA, would an appreciably higher increase in UK defence spending and deployments in the realm of continental Europe, could it lead to a better Brexit deal, i.e., good deal for the UK in return for higher commitment to European security?
Right, well, thank you very much for your question. Now, I can't swear that every single clause, dot and comma of the trade and the customs bills are presaged on the policy of leaving the customs union, but if we decide to vote that we're remaining in the customs union, then there might be some consequential legislation. But basically, that bill is about preparing for a future in which we are negotiating our own trade deals. But if we remain in the customs union, we will not be doing that. Defence and security, this is, I'm glad you've raised this because it's a really, really important question. I didn't meet a single person during the course of the referendum who said to me, Mr. Benn, I'm voting to leave the EU because I really had enough of Britain cooperating with France, Germany and the Netherlands and Sweden in facing up to the refugee crisis, trying to deal with Syria, responding to Russia's invasion of eastern Ukraine, trying to manage the flow of people around the world seeking a better life. Believe you me, when the history of this century comes to be written, I think the movement of people fleeing war and persecution, fleeing climate change if we don't get to grips with it, seeking a better life will be a really important part of that story. Now, how are we going to deal with this as a world? We're going to deal with it and have a better chance of dealing with it if we work with our friends and neighbours. And therefore, I think this view is shared amongst all of the 27 member states. It's the point that the Prime Minister, in fairness to her, made in her Munich security speech. We need to find, with imagination and flexibility, a means of continuing to have a dialogue on foreign policy, defence, security, the fight against terrorism, a threat that we all face in many European countries. And when you think about the Foreign Affairs Council, it doesn't proceed by votes, it proceeds by agreement and unanimity. Will Europe's response as a geographical entity be stronger if it includes a response that includes the United Kingdom? Yes, it will. Did President Putin wake up the day after the referendum and think, right, Europe will be weaker, I will be stronger? I think he did. And therefore, the responsibility on all of us, notwithstanding the referendum result, is to continue to work together to ensure that there is a strong European voice. We have a lot to contribute as a country, our role as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, our large development budget, and indeed the contribution we make in military terms, including through the expenditure we have on the defence budget. And it's not much talked about, but this isn't going to work if we don't find that the deal includes that kind of arrangement that allows us to continue to collaborate on what is absolutely in our mutual and shared interest.
Okay, we have a question over here first.
Thank you, Neil Brady. Can I take you back to after the transition agreement in relation to the UK's choices about customs union and single market? Because it's clear that at the end of the transition period as it stands, although the arrangement will continue for Northern Ireland in terms of customs union single market, it won't for the rest of the UK, or that seems to be the position.
Yes.
So could you elaborate on that dilemma?
Well, that is, the argument at the moment, the argument between the United Kingdom and the European Union, because the Commission chose to interpret the Article 49 fallback as meaning that Northern Ireland would remain in customs union and continue to apply the rules of the single market, as I said in my speech, knowing that that would be unacceptable to the DUP and would be unacceptable to the British government and, I have to say, unacceptable to the Brexit Select Committee. So I don't think it does follow, because if that were to be the case, as you suggested, you would have a border down the Irish Sea. Now, I don't think people are going to accept that. And that is why there is this dance around what the fallback wording actually means. It was fantastic drafting, and it contained, like the most fantastic drafting, it enabled each side to read into it that which they wished to read. But we're now getting to the point where the Commission is saying, the Irish government, the Taoiseach and Simon Coveney have both said it recently, that we really need to know how this fallback is going to work, because it's our guarantee. Now, we may solve it in the end through a trade negotiation. We may solve it through technology. But we have to know, in the absence of those two, how's it going to work? And that is what the government is now going to have to put forward in order to get through the next gate. There's been a whole series of gates in this negotiation. And back in December, I think the reason why the fallback was accepted, it changed the wording by the end of the week compared with the beginning. And I think all of those sitting around the table thought we really can't go beyond the end of the year and not even have begun moving into phase 2 of the negotiation. So there was, I think, a great political imperative to make progress, and that pushed the thing along. But it's what I said at the end. Now is the time for clarity and some certainty about how this is going to work in very, very practical terms. And the onus is now, as it has been throughout, on the UK government to set out how it sees that fallback operating in practice.
Okay, thank you. You have a question at the front. Do you want to borrow my mic, Bridget?
Thank you, Bridget Laffin, European University Institute. My question has two parts. One, and I think you've all in some ways answered it, and
Okay.
that is that are you concerned about the lack of detailed papers, proposals from the UK government, given that we're 3/4 of the way through the Article 50? And my second question, and more importantly, is there a concern that in Her Majesty's government there's a view that this is a pretty normal EU negotiation, and at the end there'll be several all-night negotiating rounds, and out of which will come the declaration?
Yeah.
And I think that would be a fatal mistake. This is much too serious for the EU for them to treat it as this kind of negotiation. It's not the common agricultural policy, it's not the budgetary financial perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, yes, I am concerned that we've got to this point with insufficient detail and specificity about what the government wants. Again, go back. There was a stage when the government was saying Brexit means Brexit and I'm not giving you a running commentary. Now, we've moved on since then, because one of the reasons we said as the Select Committee, I think, could we have a white paper, please? You know, when we joined the Common Market, we had a white paper. We had, you're not telling me we're not going to have anything at all and you'll unveil it at some point, probably to the EU first before you tell the rest of the United Kingdom. So we've moved on some way, but there is still a lack of clarity. And I think your point about the negotiation is well made, because you have heard people say, oh, in the end, the Germans will come along and say, yeah, just, sort it out. Well, I really wouldn't be sure about that at all, because this is a great challenge for the European Union. All the other substantive negotiations it has to undertake in the past, with Norway when it decided it didn't want to join, with Switzerland, with Canada, with the Ukraine, with Turkey and its partial customs union, all of those have been intended to try and bring those countries closer to the European Union. And this is the very first negotiation where the EU is having to negotiate with a member that's about to leave, that is moving away. And I'd make this point that although in one sense it can be argued the EU feels, well, we are strong because we are still united even though Britain has left. Let's be honest, the forces that gave rise to the 52% vote to leave in the UK are present in many other European countries. Look at the votes that Mrs. Le Pen got. Look how neo-fascists got 13.5% of the vote in the German federal elections, in Germany, of all countries, given the history. Look how close someone came to being elected as the president of Austria. Look across the Atlantic Ocean at what has transpired in the United States of America, where my standard policy, if you're not sure who to vote for in elections, you should always vote for the candidate called Hilary, but on this occasion... it didn't work, even though she doesn't quite spell the name correctly. But anyway, we'll leave that on one side. And therefore, this is a great challenge for the EU. And I'd make just two other points. One is this: where the British government moves. So the Prime Minister said on security cooperation, we want to work together. There's loads of practical issues. We rely on the information from the Schengen Information System too to help keep us safe from bad people who want to blow us up. The first duty of government is to protect us. And here we are on the day, and I know you've commemorated the minute's silence for all those who died in Manchester a year ago. And she said, but we recognise that to do that we will have to accept the jurisdiction of the court. Now, I agree with that. But the EU, if in those circumstances folds its arms and says, well, I'm sorry, either you're in or you're out, and we can't have any cherry picking. And by the way, one person's cherry picking is another person's unique or bespoke agreement. All those agreements I mentioned earlier, Turkey, Ukraine and so on, you could call those a plethora of cherry picking agreements, or you could call them a series of bespoke agreements. Or when the government says, you know what, we'd like to maintain a relationship with the European Medicines Agency, it makes no sense for us separately to certify that Airbus aircraft are safe to fly when the European Aviation Safety Authority has already done so. We want to stay aligned on chemicals and other things. For the European Union to say, oh, it's all difficult. And I think that EU negotiators need to be a bit careful, because if they end up pushing the government into a harder position and a harder Brexit than might otherwise be the case, that is not in Europe's interests, and it's certainly not in the interests of those of us in the United Kingdom who want a clearer, a better Brexit, if you can have such a thing. It's probably a contradiction in terms. And the final thing I would say is this. Europe can look at this negotiation in one of two ways. It can either think, the Brits are leaving, we've got to get rid of this, and then we can get back to what we were doing before. But, you know, if we end up with an agreement in which Europe feels, we're a bit grumpy because we gave too much to Britain, and we feel we're a bit grumpy because we didn't think we got a fair deal from the European Union, ask yourself this question. Is that a strong, stable basis on which to have a future relationship with our nearest friends and neighbours, who will remain our nearest friends and neighbours, even though we are leaving the institutions of the European Union? Now, I would argue that it isn't. And another way of looking at it is to say, right, you want to go? Let's look at the closest and strongest relationship we can negotiate. Heaven knows, it might provide a template to other countries in the future that don't want to make the final step of joining the European Union, but would like to have a closer relationship. And do you know what? I think a European Union that is both flexible and multi-speed, multi-layer within itself, because for me, that will keep the 27 united, and I want a strong European Union, and not a European Union which, in an attempt to impose a federalist vision, everybody in the Euro, everyone in Schengen, federalism now, because I don't think the 27 will all want to sign up to that, and a relationship in which you have close agreements with other countries that aren't members. I think that's a much better basis on which to approach this negotiation, rather than if we gain, then you lose, because this deal is going to last for quite some time to come. I apologise for the length of the answer, but you've raised a really important point about how this negotiation is approached.
Okay, we have 3 more questions.
Okay.
Can we take them in sort of rapid fire? So the guy at the back with the glasses. Down, yeah, keep going. If you keep going, Lizzie. You got the mic.
Thank you. Martin Hatfield from CREAB. I very much agree with your analysis that you set out there, but how, as a parliamentarian and representative of your constituents and someone at the heart of the democratic process, do you respond to the criticism that effective membership of the continuing membership of the Customs Union and Single Market, or membership of EFTA and the EEA, or anything else that is packaged slightly differently but is basically the same thing, amounts to continued membership of the EU without the rights and privileges of a member, and is therefore a total betrayal of what the 52% voted for?
Okay, thanks. Professor O'Leary, do you have the...
Similar question. I thought your speech was extremely clear, and you used the term clarification and clarity many times. Can you clarify for us?
I thought this was coming, yeah. Okay.
The difference between those in the Labour Party who think the UK should stay in the Customs Union and not in the single market, and those who think they should stay in both. What's the nature of the debate?
Yep.
Is it a serious debate? We should be told.
Read The Guardian, you'll get a pretty good idea of what's going on. But anyway, and other papers. Right, who was the third? Oh, yes, sir.
Keith Best, Secretary of the European Movement. I suppose it's inevitable that we've seen this very much from the media point of view and the parliamentary point of view in a monocentric, national-centric way, rather than doing the usual barrister's trick, which is to assess the strength of your opponent and look at it from the alternative position as well. Although we're trying to do that with Ireland here. I want to ask you, and I very much agree with, by implication, your proposition that the transitional period is likely to go on for a very long time, and therefore we are likely to be, in effect, still within the European Union, but without a voice, but actually technically outside it. What I would invite you to do is to just speculate what the Europe without Britain is going to look like, with a German financial and political hegemony, which will not be greeted with great enthusiasm by some of those new advent countries from Eastern Europe, without Britain having that moderating voice which has been so effective in the past, over the last 40 years, at the table in trying to ensure some of those regulations are more sensible than they were. How do you envisage Europe proceeding, particularly with what's going on in Italy now and in other countries to which you've referred?
Well, thank you all very much indeed for those questions. You're absolutely right, and we have to be able to answer that question. How do I respond to it? I say to the 52% of people who voted Leave, Leeds was split almost exactly 50-50. They never published the results for my constituency. I say, look, what you voted for is we are leaving the institutions of the European Union, and that's what's going to happen at the end of March 2019. But I then say, I'm sorry, but I don't agree that the referendum decided what our future economic and political relationship is going to be with our friends and neighbours. After all, we had a political and an economic relationship with them before we joined the common market. And you know what? We're going to have a relationship with them after we have left the European Union. Now, come with me and let's talk about trade. So if someone says, and there are some Brexiteers who make the argument, we don't need to negotiate anything, we just leave, no deal, nothing. I would then say, OK, so that'll add 10% to the price of every one of the 2,000 cars a day that we export, put up the price of cars here in the UK. Why would you want to damage business, investment, jobs, supply chains, on which depends the strength of our future economy, the tax revenue that the government gets? Look at financial services. That generates a huge amount. Over 1 million people, a lot of people in Leeds, work in the financial services industry. Why would you want to damage those things? Does it make sense to have a trade relationship in which there are no tariffs, no delays, no rules of origin, certificates, for businesses that have never seen one, wouldn't know what it looked like, no additional customs declarations, no delays at Dover? I'd say, well, that's a pretty sensible policy. Now tell me why you think it isn't. And in relation to the single market, I grant you that the question of free movement is an issue, because it was certainly an issue with many people who raised it with me, and I will link it to the answer to the next question about views within the Labour Party. But since we're going to have to abide by those rules to sell in, given that enabling our financial services industry to continue to be strong, getting a replacement for the single licence that broadcasters require currently to broadcast to 27 other countries, what's that going to look like? Ensuring that data could continue to move back and forth. That's why we need a data adequacy decision. Making sure that when you go on holiday to France, there's still an EHIC card arrangement, because otherwise you're going to be paying more for your travel insurance policy. Sorting out the aircraft, you name it. So that's the way in which I try and answer the question. But you're right. People will say, I voted for change. Where is this change? Show it to me. I think also at the same time, we also need to acknowledge, and I was much struck by what Daniel Hannan, who was on the other side in the referendum, said recently. He said, you know what, it was very close. And there is 48% of the population who took a different view. And we do have to have a mind to them. when we are taking decisions about what the right approach is to take. Now, on the question of the Labour Party, there is a small group in the Labour Party who have always been Eurosceptic, some who argued for, I think, what's known as Lexit, and who suggested that you couldn't implement socialism in the United Kingdom as long as you remained a member of the European Union. But it's a very small group of people. As I observed recently, as far as I could tell, when Chris Grayling stood up in the House of Commons and announced that he was renationalising East Coast Main Line, I didn't notice that our continuing membership of the European Union prevented him from doing so. So I don't buy that argument at all. It's our policy to bring all of the franchise back into public ownership, and as and when and if we get a Labour government, that's exactly what we're going to do. There is then a group who acknowledge the point about free movement and say we have to demonstrate that we have listened. And on that, many of the people I met in the referendum said, I'm not arguing, Hilary, that we should end all immigration. I just want us to have some control. Control posited against an absence of control. And that word did sum up, I think, what the referendum was about. But when we have eventually get to a rational debate about immigration policy, well, we can see the need for migration all around us. Because the moment operations start getting cancelled at the Leeds General Infirmary and Jimmy's because of a shortage of nurses, because we've issued insufficient visas for nurses to come from Europe, I guarantee my constituents will be coming to me and saying, Mr. Benn, why don't you get some more visas? Because I'm not waiting any longer with my painful knee and my damaged hip. So that's the second group. And then there is a third group that says, staying in the single market and the customs union, EEA, EFTA, however you want to put it. Those are the three. And Labour's policy has moved on the customs union when Jeremy Corbyn made his speech, which I very strongly welcomed, saying it will now be our policy to remain in a customs union. We've talked about full access to the single market, so there is a debate now in Labour. Well, how do you ensure that? What is the mechanism going to be? Will it be granted by the EU? Should EEA, EFTA be the route that we take in order to achieve that? And then look, I'm not in the least bit embarrassed or defensive about the fact there's a lively debate in the Labour Party, because there's a lively debate in society. And the truth about the Brexit referendum is it showed the nation was split, families were split, parties were split, the cabinet is split, and the select committee I have the honour to chair has the occasional difference of opinion. Now, lastly, what do I think the EU is going to look like? Well, I think the EU faces a choice, as I indicated in answer to your question earlier. After the referendum result, Mr. Juncker made a speech in which he said, right, let's get back to ever faster, closer, deeper union. And then President Macron made, in my view, much more nuanced and interesting speech in which he wants to progress on the euro, but also recognise the argument for something that is more multi-speed, multi-layered. Because as I indicated, I think that's what will maintain the unity of the 27, and it's going to be their choice. And at some point, the EU might sit down and quietly say to itself, right, okay, in the privacy of this room, how did we come to lose one of our most important members? How is it that when President Macron came to Britain and was interviewed by Andrew Marr, he said, you know what, if we'd had a referendum in France on membership, we might have voted to leave too. Now, for me, that really brings home what's happening in our politics, because there are two great forces at work in the world. One is the desire for control, sovereignty, self-determination. Because pace of change, I have many constituents who think they have no control at all over what's happening to their lives, and they see changes which have been to their disadvantage, and they want control. And on the other hand is the recognition that if we're going to deal with the great international challenges, as I indicated earlier, we can only do it by cooperating between nation states, by working internationally. And these two are held in tension. They were identified by Churchill and Roosevelt in the Atlantic Charter when they talked about the post-war world. And I think the referendum sent a message saying we think it's a bit out of balance. And in life and in politics, balance can be a difficult thing to achieve, but you get most harmony when you're in balance, and you get a bit of trouble when you're out of balance. And I think that's a message for everyone in Europe. And finally, there's no doubt that those who have been like-minded with the UK feel the pain of our impending departure very, very acutely. because they've been able to work with us, and now we go, and then you're left with the two great powers of France and Germany, and they're not quite sure how that is going to work out. So, we shall see.
Hilary, thank you. That's been an exceptional speech and masterly discussion, very informative and somehow reassuring. Thank you.